Gulf of Mexico and all the way up the east coast of the United States is the same species. It's Crossostrea virginica, the eastern oyster. Sometimes people call it the American oyster, the same oyster that you have on your oysters on the half shell when you go to Water Street Seafood. They build reefs, extensive reefs, but they also are harvested as a food. So the existing native oyster reefs are mostly in the Gulf of Mexico, although if you're familiar with oysters, you know that Chesapeake Bay used to be the heart of oyster harvest in the United States, although that really has shifted in the past many decades from Chesapeake and Delaware Bay centered fishery to the Gulf of Mexico. Essentially now Louisiana and Texas are the heart of oyster production in the United States. And we care about them because they're ecologically and economically valuable organisms. Let's see. Oh. Okay. I'm doing pop quiz. So this is just me to gauge what you know about oysters, so I know how in depth to go into the rest of the conversation. Okay. You just have to give me your answer. Are oysters male or female? You can just shout it out.
Yes.
Both. They're both. Good. Okay. However, they're not just one or the other. So oysters are protandrous hermaphrodites, so they can change from male to female several times during their life. So when they're small, they're typically, the majority of small oysters are male, and as they get larger, the majority of oysters are female. And we think that that's because when they grow larger, they have more energy to devote to eggs, which are larger and require more energy to create than sperm. So facts you didn't think that you, now that these are good party facts that you can tell people. All right, how do oysters eat? They filter. That's good. Oh, and I wanted to say all these cartoons were drawn by a former student and former Harte Research Institute employee, Eleni Morgan. So she did a great job with these. But yeah, oysters filter their food out of the water. So they filter phytoplankton is what they're typically eating, but they're also filtering things like detritus. They're removing excess nutrients from algal blooms and doing a lot to help clarify and clear up the bay waters, make them a nicer place to live. How many eggs can one female oyster produce in a year? Nice round number. Million. That's good. Right on the nose. So a female oyster can not lay, but can produce over 1 million oysters in a year. Wow. And oysters can start to produce eggs when they're just an inch large. So they grow really quickly because it's warm in our waters. And so an oyster that is a brand new recruited, brand new settled oyster in the spring is typically large enough that it can start producing larval oysters by that fall. So typically when we have issues like a hurricane or a storm or a spill, as long as the conditions return to normal, oyster populations in our area are able to recover really quickly. Okay, two more questions. So how many weeks does it take for a baby oyster to attach itself to a reef? 2 days, weeks, months? Oh, I got weeks on there. 2. All right. 2 to 3 weeks. So oysters go through several metamorphic stages. I like to describe it like a caterpillar becoming a butterfly. But it takes about 2 or 3 weeks for them to get to their final metamorphic stage. These little baby oysters are planktonic, so they don't have a shell. They're just floating around in the bay. And after that 2-week period, they develop this, you can kind of see it in her cartoon, this little foot here. And they're called pedivelagers because they have that foot. And they use that foot, they come down out of the water and they look for a firm surface to attach to. And they use that foot to sort of feel around for something hard, like a dock or anything, sometimes on the shell of something else. And then they develop their adult shell, and they're the oysters that we know and love. And then lastly, it's kind of like a teaser off of the last one, but how are reefs formed? Yeah. So the older generations kind of are the inside of the reef, and the younger generations attach onto the back. So those older generations and form that sort of veneer of living oysters that encases that foundation or that scaffolding of the older generations of oysters. So this is oysters are colonizers. They're colony builders, and they generally will settle in a similar environment. Okay, pop quiz over. All right, back to the presentation. All right, so again, back to oysters. Why do we care about oysters? So we care about them because a lot of us love to eat them as a food. Lots of people who come to the coast are paying money because they want to eat fresh seafood. So this is a big draw for us economically. Creates a lot of jobs, both from the fisheries, but also all the industries that depend on those oysters as a food. They create habitat. You know, here's a picture of a reef that's exposed at low tide, but you can see all the nooks and crannies that are formed in the reef that lots of organisms live in. It increases the diversity of life in the bay. Because they're filtering the water, it can improve water quality. If you like to go fishing, hook and line fishing, you know that recreational angling is a hot spot for doing that is over oyster reefs because all those nooks and crannies where the organisms live bring in sport fish. They can protect shorelines like the big living breakwater, and we're just starting to really learn the potential role of oysters in capturing and storing carbon. So you're hearing a lot about carbon sequestration these days, probably. Blue carbon. We know a lot about how marshes and seagrasses can draw down carbon. We think that oysters can play a role in this process as well. So we're just learning about this, another benefit that oysters can provide. Okay. All these great things about oysters. What's the problem? So I'm just going to play this in the background. This certainly is not the only problem, but it is something that was really brought to the radar and to the front of a lot of people's eyes in the past year. You know, oyster reefs are susceptible to a lot of things. So storms can come through and dump a ton of fresh water. Runoff from the land from those storms can smother the reefs. We can have droughts where the salinity becomes too high. It's too salty for oysters to live. We can have spills. You know, there are lots of things that can affect oysters, but in the past year, one thing that was really brought to a lot of people's attention was the concentration of commercial harvesting effort on small parts of the coast. So if you follow how oysters are managed in the state, when there are areas of the bays in which there aren't enough commercial-sized oysters to harvest, they're going to close those bays to allow those oysters to recover and grow to the market size. In those situations, the oyster boats are going to fish smaller and smaller areas, basically until all the parts of the bays are closed for that season. And so in our area in Mesquite Bay, which some of you are probably familiar with, it's just about 45 minutes up the coast, right off of the coast of like where Goose Island State Park is, the Aransas National Wildlife Refuge. We just saw incredible fishing pressure. So this was just in that little image that went across, I counted over 70 boats in that one little image at that one time. So oysters are harvested with an oyster dredge, which is essentially like a metal rake that gets pulled behind a boat. That rake is pulled across the reef and it dislodges the live oysters from the reef and then collects them into a bag that's connected to that rake. The challenge is that when you harvest oysters, you're also harvesting their habitat because they need those shells for the younger generations to attach to. So it's not like when you go fishing and you collect a fish, but you leave all the water behind or you leave the seagrass behind. When you fish for oysters, you remove the habitat and the oysters themselves. So when this fishing pressure gets really concentrated, there can be detrimental effects of those oyster shells that they require for attachment being removed to unsustainable levels. Okay, so what can we do to help address this problem? And this is what this whole talk is focused on, is that we can take small actions within our community to help restore and conserve this important natural resource. And one way that we can do it is this oyster shell recycling program. So we can recycle oyster shells, which when they are harvested out of the bay, are this important resource which is now out of place. And instead of them going to the landfills or to competing uses, there are lots of uses for oysters still. People love to put them in their parking lots and put them in the gardens and use them for construction and chicken feed. There's an incredible amount of uses for oysters, it turns out, for the shells. We can find a way to capture those shells and put them back in the bays where nature intended to keep these reefs going into the future. The reason that this works, this is I think it's my one biology slide. I can't help myself. So the reason that oyster shell recycling works and putting this material back in the bays to rebuild reefs work is because of this oyster life cycle. So if you start over here, you have your male and female oysters in love, And they are releasing eggs and sperm into the water column. You get fertilized eggs. And as I said, they go through several metamorphic stages as plankton in the water for 2 to 3 weeks. And that last stage, the pedivelager, which is this little cartoon over here that has this foot, comes down out of the water where it's so bright, down to the bottom of the bay and looks for a place to attach. And as I said, they can attach to lots of things. If you've been out in the bay and pulled a piece of PVC out, it probably had oysters on it. But the most reliable place for them to attach is reefs, because if there's oysters already living there, that's a very environmentally friendly place for them to grow. If they can't attach to an oyster shell, if they can't find something to attach to, they're still going to try to attach to a grain of sand or a little bit of mud, and they will get sedimented over and they will die. So they can't stay in the water column beyond that period of time. Yeah.
Is this in the intertidal, or are they always, their life cycle is underwater?
Their life cycle is underwater. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
We were at Whooping Crane tour, and we saw what you were saying before about just a plethora of fishing boats that, and the captain told us that they were all harvesting oysters.
Yeah.
So who's in charge of saying, okay, this is too much for this area? Who decides?
It's Texas Parks and Wildlife is the agency responsible for managing the fisheries. And they do extensive sampling during the season. So they're constantly going back out and measuring a whole bunch of characteristics about those reefs. So they're saying how many oysters are out there, what size are they, and they have the stoplight metric. So when oyster characteristics fall below a certain threshold, from green to yellow and then from yellow to red, is when they would close that area to harvest. But were you recently on it?
It was last year.
Okay. Yeah, it's just that even when the season opened this year, if you've been following, the season opened November 1st, and it opened with the fewest areas open to harvest of really any year in memory, because the oysters in the Gulf, they're in rough shape right now. So the fishermen are struggling as well, because there's not very many places that they can fish. So you get this unintended consequence of all those boats in very few locations. So the last piece here of why this works is kind of this last step where the baby oysters need to attach to the shells of the older generations on an oyster reef. Like I said, if the reefs have been unsustainably harvested, those shells aren't there, or there aren't enough shells that are available for those larval oysters to attach to. And when those shells are gone, then essentially the rest of this process shuts down. So what this shell recycling program does, it's really simple, is it just takes these shells, nothing has to happen to them. It's not like a battery or something where it has to be transformed. We just take them out of the water, let them sit in the sun for 6 months to sun bleach, and then we just put those shells back in the places where we have measured that need them most. We put them back in the water in the best places at the best times based on the science, and that then allows this process to continue. So then oyster shell recycling is a similar sort of circular process. So we start over here. The oyster boats are harvesting oysters from the reefs. They are sold. In our area, typically, you're going to eat oysters at a restaurant or a seafood festival. Where Jeff and I had moved from almost 20 years ago now on the East Coast, a lot of people would go out. The tide went out a lot further, so people go out with their buckets and collect oysters too. But for here, it's mostly these restaurants. So this is who we're working with. People eat the oysters. The shucked shells then would normally go in with the trash and go to the landfill. But with the oyster shell recycling program, what Sink Your Shucks does is it comes in at that point, works with the restaurants to separate the shells out from the trash, puts that in a separate bin, and then that bin, for us, gets taken to some land that's leased for a really low fee from the Port of Corpus Christi. And those shells are stockpiled until we have a large enough amount of shells, and then we go and restore reef where it's needed most with those recycled shells. And I'm going to talk about all of the successes that we've had with this process, because we can restore reefs a couple of ways. So I was showing that video of those boats in Mesquite Bay. Well, right around the corner in St. Charles Bay, this same summer as we took that video, we restored 22 acres of restored oyster reef, or of oyster reef. And we did this a couple of ways. So one way is these barges have recycled oyster shells on the barge. So we put over 1 million pounds of oyster shells back into the water. So we go out ahead of time. You can kind of see there's some PVC poles. I don't know if you can see that in the image, but we go out there ahead of time. We stake out the locations where the reef needs to be restored. We permit the area, which is its own set of challenges. And then we hire a contractor to come in and they put that, I know. Every time I watch that, I think, really close. And then we monitor the reef. So this is a video of our boat, our lab's boat out there, then going out to the reef to figure out, did it work? Are there oysters growing on this reef? Is it doing all the things that we expect it to do? Is it providing all the benefits that were lost when the reefs were degraded or destroyed? So we measure things like oyster size. We put sampling trays, oyster sampling units. We anchor them into the reef with rebar. One of my students calls it stapling them. She says, we staple them in place. So we use rebar and put these trays down, and then we pull those trays, and it's like a snapshot of the restored reef, and we can collect all the critters that are in there and understand how the reef is developing. So from my side, being a professor, this has supported a lot of student research and provided a lot of scientific training to young scientists who are now making their way out into Texas and beyond, and sharing this, kind of spreading this expertise on how to restore habitats and conserve habitats beyond the coastal bend.
Is the New York area doing any of this? Because they used to have wall-to-wall oysters.
Yes. So there's a program in New York that's pretty well known. There's the New York Harbor School, which is there, which is a public high school that actually trains students in the maritime trades. And one of the things that they teach them about is oyster mariculture. And so they have an oyster shell recycling program, the Billion Oyster Project, and they have students involved in doing things like underwater engineering and diving and surveying and science. So yeah, there are lots of local programs that are suited to doing this within their area.
I believe in Louisiana, they're harvesting their own oysters in cages.
Yeah, so that would be aquaculture based.
Right, is that a good thing or a bad thing? And because, in Port of Corpus, I understood there was 90 oyster boats, and they paid for commercial licenses. So they're arguing, hey, we pay for our license, we want to catch oysters. And so there's a big argument there, but shouldn't they be reseeding the bottom with oyster babies?
Yes, it's complicated. So there are oyster leases, these privately held oyster leases in Galveston Bay only in Texas, where folks do lease a particular area of the bay bottom and they do reseed, but they are the only ones who have the license to fish those areas. In the public grounds, which are everywhere else in Texas, somebody could, it would be hard for somebody to put $100,000 of material back on the bottom that could be harvested by anyone. So everybody, there's a lot of conversation right now about should the private leasing strategy be something that's reopened and allow that in more of the bay systems, because we know that people can take care of those reefs, but it's expensive. So somebody who just has a boat and is fishing on a public reef may not have the ability to take on the cost of lease.
Well, just for purpose of discussion, I know we restock the bays with spotted redfish,
Right.
Yellow tail, and other. Is the state ever considering reseeding with oysters?
Well, possibly, but there's no oyster hatchery in the state right now, regardless fish hatchery.
Could there?
There could be, and there are private groups that are getting involved now, and there are three or four permitted oyster farms in Texas now. So for those of you who know Brad Lomax in our area, that was permit number 1. So our area is kind of on the map for being the first area for aquaculture, farming oysters, or ranching oysters, he calls it. So that is really where a lot of us think there's a huge potential in the future.
How do you use a tractor out there?
Yeah, exactly.
We do it all the time, every day.
Can you use a tractor out there?
Yeah.
But it can take the pressure off these reefs, right? Like it would provide more reliable sources to food of the oysters that we love while removing some of this pressure.
Are they gonna dredge your new reefs here?
So St. Charles Bay is closed to commercial harvest permanently right now. I mean, since 2017, it's been closed, and that's always been.
Now that you're growing this up, they'll put pressure on the state.
Hopefully not. I mean, we've had a lot of these conversations that there needs to be a way to recognize that oysters are a fishery, yes, and that is very valuable ecologically and economically, but they also are a habitat and that long list of other things that they provide, and you've got to find a way to provide those benefits as well. So right now, what we're doing is working in those closed bay systems. Yeah. And then, so this is the other way that we restore reefs, and maybe some of you have participated in these in the past, and if you haven't, please come join us this spring. So we do these community-based reef restoration events. This is at Goose Island State Park. This is actually when the deeper reef is being built because of the barge right out behind us. But we invite the public, or this was an event that we did with Yamaha with some corporate partners who have provided funding, and we bring people out. We teach them. You'll see there's a bunch of different educational stations. We teach folks about right there at the edge of the bay, all the importance of the reefs. We teach them how to take water quality. We pull an area of reef out of the water so you can see all the critters that are living in there. And we bag up those recycled oyster shells and put them back in the water. So like bag by bag, we restore oyster reefs. These are actually a couple of those guys who are talking. Those are a couple of retired game wardens that we get out there. We also have pretty good expertise in the community. We teach people to shuck oysters because it's important to know as well. And these are some graduate students kind of giving educational talks. So like I said, this is Goose Island State Park on the runway. If anybody knows where the runway is, kind of right at the bend of, I guess it's Fulton Beach Road? Fulton Beach Road, I think. So these are all recycled oyster shells from the Sink Your Shucks program. And folks come, we bag them up. We use these PVC tubes to hold these bags. These are biodegradable bags. We used to use a geotech bag, but we've moved now to just using natural fibers and biodegradable materials. After we fill a whole bunch of those shells, shell bags, we bring them down to the edge of the water. You can see that big stack of bags that we bagged up, and then we move those shell bags down into the water. With the idea being, this is in really shallow water, so we're bagging them up so that the wind and the wave action doesn't just spread the shells everywhere. In the deeper water, we can just put the shells out there and they're fine. But in the shallow water, the shells will just get spread everywhere. So each of these bags then kind of serves as a nucleus for those larval oysters to attach to those shells and get encased in living reef. You can see the bags in the water, and you basically just build the reef like you would put tiles on a floor or bricks in a wall.
Wow. Very cool.
Yeah, so our at txoysters.org, we can also share with Tasha when we have our events in the spring. So we usually do this in the spring because it's the time when we have the most larval oysters in the water, and so we want to put that material out there at the best time to capture those oysters. Okay, I just wanted to say we're not the only people that are restoring reef in our area. So there's over 100 acres of reef that's been restored in that Aransas Bay system. So we've contributed. You can see up in St. Charles, the St. Charles Bay Reef was where I was showing all those videos from. We've also restored reef on the southern end of Goose Island State Park in Aransas Bay. Parks and Wildlife has done a huge restoration recently at Grass Islands Reef. The Nature Conservancy has also restored over 50 acres of reef in Kopanobe at Lap Reef, and we've also contributed to reef restoration up there. So there's lots of groups that are getting together and contributing to this effort. I did just want to highlight a couple of the sort of success stories from using recycled oyster shells. This is in Kopanobe. This is 6 acres that was restored at Lap Reef. This map here just shows you this kind of, so this is where Lap Reef is in this square up in the top. This kind of gray stippled area, that's where there was living reef. And then we put in this sort of patchwork of reef mounds in that area where there was no more reef, with the idea that we could put this material down and then it could expand over time. And then this picture we took underwater, I think it was 3 weeks after we put the material down. And you can see, if you kind of glaze your eyes over, there's these spadefish that are on the reef right away. So it's very obvious that organisms are using the material and they're limited by the oyster reef not being there. We put that material back in the water and the oysters are growing on it. We see the organisms responding really quickly. This is the Aransas Bay side, that southern side of Goose Island State Park, where we've restored 8 acres of oyster reef. We actually recently expanded this, and we've also worked with the Department of Transportation when they took down the Kopanobe Bridge. We actually worked with them to take material to mitigate for reef that was lost during those efforts to expand this reef out as well. So all those kind of shaded areas in the water, those are the reef pads, and these are each 20 yards by 30 yards by foot off of the bottom, to give you an idea of the scale. And we put them a foot off of the bottom so they don't just get sedimented in. This one was actually a pretty cool project because this is that same one that you just looked at, the overhead. We wanted to see, recycled oyster shells can be limiting. You can only get as much back as you can recycle from restaurants and seafood wholesalers. So we wanted to look at how does it work if you use river rock or crushed concrete or limestone, or, although it wasn't in the study, we looked at recycled porcelain coming out of the residential waste stream. And the good news is that oysters will recruit to all of these materials. So we've been able to restore reef when we don't have enough shell by substituting other materials in, or doing like a base of river rock, for example, and then topping it with oyster shells. We try to use the natural material as much as we can. This is where I was showing you the videos, St. Charles Bay. This was the first 5 acres. Now we're over 20 acres in St. Charles Bay. Again, the recycled oyster shells on the barges. The thing I want to highlight about this is that 2 weeks after we started restoring at St. Charles Bay, we did put our first 5 acres in the water. 2 weeks later, literally that picture is the eye wall of Hurricane Harvey is directly over our site. And so we all had evacuated, we were in Austin watching this hurricane come through. And I just thought this is so much money and so much time that's just gone. Like, we did all of this work. But the good news was, I'm going to show this one graph to make my point. So the hurricane came in September 2017. This is, the blue line shows the natural reefs, the size of oysters on the natural reefs. The red line shows the size of oysters on the restored reef. Not only did the reef stay intact, that big drop in salinity that happened in the bay is because of all the rainfall that came from Harvey, actually spawned, it caused the oysters to reproduce, to spawn really quickly. And when we got back out there, we couldn't get out to our reef for a month. It was totally covered up in spat, in newly recruited, newly attached baby oysters. So the reef was resilient, and it provided this great substrate for that recruitment event that we didn't expect. And the oysters grew really fast. So this was in September of 2017, this first measurement on the restored reef. This is in May of 2018. The size of oysters on the restored reef was the same as that on the natural reef. So the recovery, the growth of oysters on that new reef was really rapid. And we saw, what we want to see is that our reef is performing like the natural reefs in the area. And that's what we were able to see. So we're happy about that. So again, it just kind of all comes back to being able to recycle these shells, something that's very simple, putting them back in the water to rebuild reefs. So far, the Sink Your Shucks program, this small program in our area in the coastal bend, we've restored 40 acres of oyster reef. I had to update the slide. 40 acres within just our little area. I mean, it's something that you can measure. even with the 25 acres of reef, we calculated that that produced over 10 million new oysters in less than 18 months, and that these oysters were filtering up to 280 million gallons of water a day. So this is like when you can really have a tangible, from recycled, picking up these stinky shells from the restaurants, holding on to them, but putting them back in the water and really seeing the results of these efforts. And then just my last video is just to show you that when we put these reefs in the water, it works. This is one of the restored reefs. Terry Fowler was diving, and you can see how many oysters are on this reef. You can kind of see when he gets off the edge of it, but up on the reef where all the material is, it's dense populations of oysters. And in some of his videos, I don't know if you can see it in this one, you'll see fish that are swimming through and taking a bite of the reef, and it really just shows what a benefit that these areas are to our bays. So this is where I'm gonna kick it off to Peyton, and I just want to say that we're really excited because we've developed this new partnership that has really limitless possibilities, where the Harte Research Institute has been running this oyster shell recycling program since 2009. And the Texas Surf Conservancy now is taking this on and has lots of plans to grow it even beyond our ability. So.
Thank you, Dr. Pollack, for a great talk. My name is Peyton Gardner. I'm with the Texas Surf Conservancy. So some of y'all might have remembered the Texas Surf Museum downtown at Water Street Market. So that's now the Texas Surf Conservancy. We've closed our doors as a cultural institution and kind of ready for this exciting new chapter. And taking over Sink Your Shucks has really been the kickstart of that. While it's fresh on my mind, so the other thing I do is I work with Brad Lomax at the state's first oyster farm, which Dr. Pollack alluded to earlier. And I just want to say that being at the Coastal Bays Foundation, the coastal bend is really a leader both in oyster conservation and mariculture. So Sink Your Shucks was the first of its kind in Texas, the first oyster shell recycling program. We also, like she said, the Texas Oyster Ranch, which is Brad Lomax's farm, that was the first oyster farm in the state. And also Representative Todd Hunter and Brad Lomax, they kind of spearheaded the legalization of oyster mariculture. So the Coastal Bend should be really proud in what we're doing for the state's oysters. In a very comprehensive way, we've kind of been the vanguard in all of these issues. But yeah, so the Surf Conservancy is now operating Sink Your Shucks. We're really excited about this. Right now we have 2 participating restaurants, Water Street Oyster Bar in Virginia's and Port Aransas, but we're looking to expand that and even grow into San Antonio and Austin, especially as the kind of dire state of Texas's oysters is really being highlighted right now with the close of some of the bays. So yeah, we're hoping to expand into San Antonio and to Austin and reach as many restaurants as we can in the Coastal Bend as well. So if y'all have any information or any leads on any restaurants that might be interested, please reach out if you can. But yeah, we hope to expand the program. Austin's kind of our next target. Sink Your Shucks historically has gone to some oyster-centered events around the state, and we hope to continue that. But anyway, we're really excited to be working with Harte Research Institute and hope to grow the program more. So thank you.
Thank you so much. How do you go about, pursuing a company or like seafood markets to get oyster shells?
Right now, we're really just reaching out, either going in person or sending emails as possible. But I'll say that it takes a lot of time and staff time and space, obviously, to collect oyster shells. So we do offer tax incentives and try to do what we can to compensate the restaurants for their time and effort. Yeah.
Okay. That's information that we should try to share on our end. Scream it from the rooftop. So.
And I think another thing that we've learned, which Brad and Richard have been really good at, and I think maybe they were on the leading edge, is that restaurants are interested in showing how they're contributing to the community as well, and that they have sustainable seafood practices and things like that. So I think there's also an opportunity for the restaurants to have that benefit for themselves as well. Obviously, they have to put some skin in the game in terms of helping us collect the shells, but they also have this benefit of being able to claim, tell people that they're part of the shell recycling program and they're giving the shells back to restore what they save.
And that's the other thing we do is we can provide didactic material and signs and other ways for the restaurants to kind of highlight their participation and everything they're doing for the oysters. Yeah.
Can I suggest that y'all go back there?
Yeah.
We're trying to.
Oh, sure.
Oh,
yeah.
And I had a question too. There was a question of it. Dr. Pollack? Yes. Has there been any studies done as to, like our petrochemical industries, if that affects the oyster farms at all?
Yeah, so the health department does a lot of surveys because oysters are harvested for food. They do a lot of surveys to look at least things like E. coli and things that could affect human health when you're eating oysters. I believe that they look at metals and contaminants like that as well. My group doesn't take any of those measurements, but in general, the oyster bottoms in Texas, I mean, I eat oysters every time we go down the boat and collect. So, if you're getting oysters from a reputable place, from a restaurant, seafood wholesaler in Texas, or from one of the places in town that's selling oysters right off of the boat, I wouldn't be worried about it. They do have areas. If you look up the state health services, they have maps for every bay system in Texas that shows exactly where the areas are that would be closed because they're close to industry or because they're close to where the river water would flow out after a storm, for example. So a lot of those areas that might be a risk are just, they don't allow any harvest in those areas at all.
Thank you.
When is your next sinking of shucks?
We'll do them this spring. We don't have the dates planned yet, but we typically target April and May because it's a little bit warmer, so the oysters are getting ready to spawn, and also people are happier to be out there when it's not so cold anymore. And we're typically done by the end of May with those events. But we'll make sure that we share. We try to look at the community calendar and not put it at the same time that a lot of other things are happening. So
Just not April 22nd. That's Earth Day. That's our Earth Day Bay Day. And last year
Yes.
you brought
That's what I was
out,
gonna say.
it was a huge hit. I mean, to see these kids out
Yes.
there bagging, I almost had tears in my eyes. Like they just loved it, and they were right there in the mix, like being coastal stewards.
That's a
And
really good point. So we do these mobile bagging events now where we kind of like bring the oysters to the people so that if people can't make it out to our couple of events that we do in the spring, we bring like baby pools full of oyster shells and bags, and people can bag the shells, and then we'll bring them out and put them out.
very impressive.
I know that you are, with the Sink Your Shucks, focused on restocking with oyster shells, but you also showed that it can be augmented with different things. Have you all been talking to like TxDOT when they bring down the Humber Bridge with getting some of that material possibly?
So that's a good question, and it's a little complicated because those roads have been driven on for a long period of time, and so there can be oil and things like that on them. So like even when TxDOT took down the Coconut Bay Bridge, they didn't use that material. They actually got recycled oyster shells from Hillman's, I think, and from Albies, and put those in the water to restore reefs. So I know a lot of times that sometimes that material gets used for offshore restoration, but I think oftentimes it's like the legs of the bridges and things like that. For us, because we're in shallower water, we're limited by, it needs to be smaller size material. So oftentimes we're looking at that already broken down, like crushed concrete that's coming out of a washout of a concrete truck is usually where we get our concrete, or those materials that are just already graded by a materials yard. So it's not that it can't be used. We haven't used it yet just because of those constraints. And it's expensive, to restore these reefs, so oftentimes we're trying to find the best material and the best value. So that's what we've used so far.
In that same vein, in terms of restoration projects, you said that y'all done kind of like a pilot study of different materials when shell isn't available.
Yeah.
Is there a material that's more successful, quicker in recruitment?
It really depends. So we calculated a benefit cost ratio for using different materials, but it's going to depend on the cost at that time. Like those costs are really highly variable. So for example, the last couple times that we've done these restorations at Goose Island State Park, Derek Construction, who's usually building those reefs for us, he's used limestone because it was the thing that was the lowest cost at the time, which was surprising to me. But apparently materials have gotten very expensive, and even that washout from concrete trucks is really difficult to get. So it used to be we'd use all of our oyster shell first, then the concrete was the next cheapest thing that worked really well, and then kind of went from there. And now it's I think it's been limestone the last 2 times they've put material in. I think in Galveston Bay though, they use river rock because that's what they can get up in their area more readily. So, but I guess to say ecologically, like we measured how many oysters will attach onto a piece of limestone versus oyster shell, for example. It was very similar ecologically, and then we looked at, does it matter what material it is? Like, will all the crabs and fish and things inhabit those reefs? And it was really similar as well. I mean, ecologically speaking, just getting that hard material back in the water is the most important thing.
Is metal an option? Any type of metal?
That's a good question. We've never used metal. I don't think I've ever heard anyone using metal. Like Sharon said, we did try to use crushed porcelain, which actually worked great, but it kind of freaked people out. But like tubs, toilets, and sinks crushed up back into the bay. But the oysters will really attach on any of those hard surfaces. I think the metal could be an issue depending on like what it's transforming into and the bay, but I haven't tried it.
Because I've heard the blades for the wind turbines, they can't break them down. It's just costs too much money. So I was thinking
that sounds like a student project.
Yeah.
I'm always like, we don't know, but we could actually build a thesis project around that. Yeah.
You're a teacher, professor. What grade would you give our oyster health in this region?
I'm so glad you asked this question.
Well, you described over-harvesting and limitations for those opportunities. So are we hanging on at a seed? What are we?
That's such a good question. So I'm going to promote a separate project that I'm involved with at the Institute, which some of you may have been a part of, which is the Texas Coastal Ecosystem Health Report Card. So we're actually developing a report card to try to gauge the health of lots of different things, not just oysters, but like marshes and actually community resiliency and water quality and fisheries and lots of different components. And we originally released our first report card in 2019, but it was very small. It was like our first attempt at this, and we just did a coastwide report card. This year we've been working really closely, over the past 2 years, we've been working really closely with all of our community partners and agency partners to try to create something that's really usable, not just sort of a one and done thing. And so we're actually creating report cards for all the individual bay systems from the Laguna Madre, Coastal Bend, San Antonio Bay System, Matagorda Bay System, and a coastwide report card. So very soon, January to February, we will release the 2023 report card, and it has grades for oysters in the individual bay systems as well as coastwide, as well as all those other things. So we're still, I don't want to like preempt it because we're still like getting the final polish on those things, but this is exactly why we've recognized that this report card is important. This is sort of our baseline report card of how are things right now, and then our idea is every other year we'll publish a new report card that says over the past 2 years, have things improved? Are they going down? Why might that be? So that, when people, for example, if you're a funder and you want to be allocating funds to limited projects, maybe you can use the report card to help understand where the funds are needed most. Or if you're a community that's trying to promote your area for funding in the future and you might not have the capacity to be crunching these long-term data sets like the Harte Research Institute is, now we've provided a product back to them that they can use to just discuss the state of their system.
I'm excited to hear that because I think that would be beneficial in the work that you're doing to convince folks to come on board.
Yeah, that's what we're hoping. Yeah. Jeff. I hesitate to call
I
him.
know. You're not allowed to ask questions.
You mentioned carbon sequestration. Can you just talk a little bit about how that works and whether the loss of fisheries is a meaningful loss of carbon sink compared to
Yes.
forests or other places?
Yes. Yeah, I was gonna put a slide in here and then I didn't put the slide in here, so I'm just gonna walk you through it. But so everyone's probably roughly familiar with carbon sequestration by trees. I usually start at trees, right? So trees or plants, they photosynthesize, right? So they take up CO2 and create plant tissue with that CO2 with light. So they use photosynthesis as food, essentially. So they take up CO2 from the atmosphere and they put it into the trunks or the plant material, but they also put it into the roots, and most importantly, it gets stored in the soils. So like the soils of the forest floor are loaded with carbon. You know, the marsh, the salt marsh, if you're ever out there, and it's like that thick black mud loaded with carbon. So oysters do a very similar thing, but they're not plants, but they eat tons of plant material because they consume phytoplankton. So there's many more phytoplankton taking up much more carbon in the marine environment than there are trees taking up this carbon. So those phytoplankton also photosynthesizing, sucking up a bunch of carbon from the atmosphere. Then the oysters are filter feeding, consuming those phytoplankton with that carbon in them. And then by creating feces and pseudofeces, which is like you can keep dumping material on oysters and they'll keep processing it, they move that carbon from the water column to the sediments around them, which then gets sedimented over time, and that carbon will no longer circulate to the atmosphere. So we have a lot to learn still about the ways that oysters do this. People originally thought, well, oysters make their shells out of calcium carbonate. That must be how they trap carbon, is that they put them in their shells. But it turns out that when oysters create their shells, they're breathing, they're respiring just like we do. How we exhale CO2, so do the oysters.
Wow.
So the balance of making their shell is actually kind of a wash because they're also respiring CO2 while they build their shell. But when they capture that carbon that's already in the phytoplankton and move it to the sediments, it's this really incredible pump. We think that we're still learning about how well it works. So I actually have a student building her whole dissertation on understanding how natural reefs may be sequestering carbon, how restored reefs may be sequestering carbon, with my idea being that people want to spend money to restore reefs, so they want to make conservation decisions to close areas of the bay, and this could be information that they can use in that decision. And what we do know is when reefs are disturbed, of course, if they're going to be dredged or something happens to them, that carbon in the sediments then is going to get resuspended and you'll lose those benefits. So that's part of the importance of trying to restore in these closed areas where all that carbon falls into the nooks and crannies of the reef and it stays there.
Wow.
Yeah. I said I was going to give a science lesson, but that's a really important one. I think.
That's very
It's a really
interesting.
important one.
At the top of your presentation, you said that the Northeast had been the primary oyster grounds, and now Texas and Louisiana have overtaken that.
Yeah.
Are they in a crisis? I don't want to use the word crisis. We're in crisis, but I feel like we're in crisis.
I mean, they're in a new era at this point. Like they have a lot of aquaculture going for them now. They've turned a lot of attention to aquaculture. They've done a ton of reef restoration. I mean, more federal investments in reef restoration in that area than in any other place in the U.S. So there's a lot being done to bring oysters back. But the truth is, the Chesapeake Bay today is not what the Chesapeake Bay was at the turn of the 20th century, and so they're probably never going to get back to where they were. And I think that that's an important thing to recognize with restoration, is that you can start to build your way back up, but oftentimes much more has been lost than you're going to recover. It will take a long time to restore. So that's why I think conservation is so important, because it's much cheaper and easier to conserve what's still out there than it is to try to catch up later. Yeah.
And I'll say too, Texas is kind of catching up to their mariculture operations. So Texas is the last state that on the coast to legalize oyster mariculture. And so I think that's one reason the success of Sink Your Shucks moving forward is so important, is because likely mariculture in Texas is going to boom. So there's going to be so many more shells to collect, which is going to lead to so much more restoration. So, yeah.
Yes.
And so I was a little surprised to hear about the quarantine you have in the process for
left in the shells, because like cold water states like the Northwest, if you just recreationally go gather a bunch of oysters, you're supposed to shuck them and put those shells right back out there.
So that may be the difference. The quarantine period is because most of these are coming through, again, restaurants. They don't know where the restaurant, they could have had Florida oysters or Louisiana oysters. And so I think that's, the scale is larger and they don't want to risk like an invasive introduction or something by having those shells still fresh. Yeah. I think if you take them out of your waters and put them back in, if it's a smaller scale operation, that risk is much less. Luca.
I was gonna ask, where does like the first generation of oysters get their shells? Like, I know that the younger oysters get their shells from older oysters, but where do they get them?
That's a good question. So they get the calcium from the water and the carbon from the atmosphere, and they combine those together to build their shells. They make a material called calcium carbonate, and like similar that we have in our bones, and they build their shells with that. That's a good question. All right. Well, thank you so much for inviting us here.
Thank you so much.
Remember I said there was going to be a post-testament and a pre-test and a post-test? We want to make sure that you did learn something, because there was a lot on your little test on your little quiz that I did.
Oh, okay.
So can we go through those again and see how much the response is?
I don't know. Do we still have it up?
You could really good.
I know they did pretty well.
I'll let you go to it.
Let's see.
Let's go and see how much you learned today.
Oh, no pressure, no pressure.
No pressure, no pressure.
Well, now I'm going to feel bad if you get these wrong, but
No indication.
do you remember what they're called? Yeah, protandrous hermaphrodites. Yeah, so protandrous means that they switch from male to
I
female.
should hand out candy canes to get the right answer.
How do they eat? You guys had this one already. They filter feed. 1 million oysters in a year.
Can hear you all.
We're giving the answers away.
How many weeks does it take for a baby oyster to attach itself to a reef?
2 to 3 weeks.
3 weeks.
And how are reefs formed?
How are reefs formed? Oh.
Yeah. 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 All A's. All A's. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you guys so much.
So
I'm just
our
gonna close
next
on that.
step is going to be on Monday, January 9th, from 5:30 to 7. That will be the state of the port. Come out and support them, please, at the Ortiz Center. So please note the different locations. It's not going to be here. It's going to be at the Ortiz Center. Saturday, February 4th is our Adopted Beach at Packery Channel. It's a voluntary cleanup. So please come out and help us clean up Packery Channel. April 22nd, and Tasha mentioned this, is our Earth Day Bay Day. We do it every year, yay! At Heritage Park, lots of fun. We do have the art contest that we have every year, so that person's art is now the feature for the poster. And so it can be a painting, a drawing, a sketch, a photograph representing the beauty of our coastal bends, natural resources, wildlife, and promoting awareness. We are accepting email high-resolution JPEGs, and you will do it to spatterson@bayfoundation.org. You can find out more about that on our Coastal Bend Basin at Bay's Foundation website. And then that is www.baysfoundation.org. And then stay tuned for the opportunity to be a sponsor or to have a booth, have a table to present your stuff. It's all free and it's open to the public, and it's a wonderful, wonderful day. It'll be sunny and beautiful downtown.
Rain or shine, rain or shine.
Hopefully you shine. And please, 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 if you are not a member of the Coastal Bend Bays Foundation, please, please, please sign up to be a member. It's a minimal cost. It helps support programs like this. And so if you want to keep seeing things like this and learning to take pre-test and post-test and pop quiz and adding to your knowledge base, please, please continue to come and support our Coastal Issues Forums and also become a member of the Bays Foundation.
Bring a friend.
Bring a
That's
friend.
right, bring a friend.
Sign up for a chance to win a prize.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, wow.
We have a prize, annual drawing. Mm-hmm.
And there are multiple levels, including the students and seniors. And with that, I would say thank you all again for coming. Good night and be safe going home, and happy holidays to you as well.
Go eat oysters. Go eat oysters.